Leadership isn't just about making plays. It's about inspiring teammates, fostering trust, and building a winning culture on and off the court. Today, we're going to cover topics that dive into how players grow into leaders and how coaches shape those journeys. All right, welcome in everybody. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. We are really excited to talk today about leadership and how that plays a role in basketball across the board, whether you're a new player or you're a coach or you're someone who's been experienced in this game. Leadership is a very integral role and part of all sports, I would argue, but definitely on the basketball court. I guess the first question here to you, Augie, is why is leadership so important in basketball?
Well, I think the reason it's important is because, as a coach, you want to get your players to, first of all, understand what you're looking for. You want this style of play, you want them taking these kind of shots, and you want them to run the offense this kind of way and commit to doing these things on defense. But it's hard to get them to actually do it and to get the buy-in. So that's where the leadership comes in, like the player leadership, to get the buy-in and to get kind of everybody to do it. And, I'd argue that your captains are kind of first responsible as far as players go for making that happen. But I think that's why it's important, is because you want the buy-in, you want everybody on the same page, and that takes leadership.
Yeah, I think the players' leadership, obviously you have to have a coach who can lead, but players being able to lead each other is such a valuable asset to any team, because the reality is as a coach, you're going to be saying something, and at a certain point, it's going to become a little bit monotonous, right? Like, all right, come on, we got to box out. All right, we got to box out. And the players hear the same thing over and over. But once they get that same level of leadership from a teammate, and now that teammate is telling them the same thing, I think it has more of a chance to stick and more of a chance for them to say, okay, my teammates are holding me accountable and we need to be on the same page here. So now I'm more likely to buy in than if I'm just hearing it from my coach. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Totally. And that's a good word to use, is accountable. Like, it's all about the accountability. And the players that have good leadership hold the other players on the team accountable, and it's not the coach that has to do it. Anytime we talk about like player leadership, I always think about Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant, because they were kind of like feared a little bit by their teammates. And I would argue that that's a form of good leadership, maybe not the ultimate form to have your teammates kind of dislike you, but still, nonetheless, holding them accountable is going to make your team better.
Yeah, and you just brought up, accountability. What other aspects to leadership are there when we talk about a team sport like basketball? Like, are there any other things that come to mind when we say that word leadership?
Well, the main thing that comes to mind for me is like lead by example. Like that's one form of leadership, right? Is to lead by example and do everything right. I heard someone say something like Steve Nash had great leadership, but he just led by example. He wouldn't open his mouth. He wouldn't bark at anybody. He wouldn't tell anybody, you got to do it like this or anything, but he would just do his job and do it to the best of his ability and do it right. And that was kind of lead by example, which to me is, if you have two captains, you need maybe one of them's got to be the lead by example guy, but you can't have just two lead by example guys, because they got to be vocal. And I guess that's another part of leadership, is kind of the communication, vocal part of it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's funny, when you were talking about lead by example, my first thought was, you just can't have two of those guys or three of those guys. And then you said the exact same thing. So yeah, there's definitely a value in being a lead by example person, because players, they see it, whether they recognize it, they see, okay, so and so does this, and so I need to do that as well. But you definitely have to have that balance of someone who's saying like, okay, and here's why, and yes, you need to show up at this time, and whatever it is. I agree, you have to have both. Now, when we talk about the different leadership styles, I think that players can fit into either one of those depending kind of on their personality. And I think sometimes you have people that veer more towards one than the other. But I also think that you can push kids to be one way or more the other, right? Like if they're maybe a little bit more in the middle of the road, as far as, they lead by example and they'll say stuff every once in a while, you can try and push that kid to be like, hey, I want you to talk more. I want you to be someone who speaks up more and has a voice here, because we need someone like that. And that's hard some years, where I'm sure you've had it. You have a team where nobody's really a vocal leader, and you're like, all right, who am I going to try and develop into that guy?
Totally. Yeah. And that's probably the hardest thing, because the lead by example guys, a lot of times, if they are like the quiet type and they don't want to, speak up and lead in that kind of way, it's because of a reason. It's because that's their personality type. Like in real life, off the court, they're very quiet and kind of timid. And when they get on the court, they can kind of unleash and compete hard, but doesn't mean they're speaking up and saying things that need to be said, because, that's just the way they are. And so I think as far as coaching goes, like I've learned, like the better I am at coaching, or not the better I am, but like the better I get, is the more I understand that the hard conversations need to happen. Like the things actually need to be said. Like when someone has a game where they're taking bad shots, like that conversation needs to be had like, hey, you player X, you can't be taking those kind of shots, those kind of things. And that could be coming from a captain or a coach, but I think the captains need to be able to have those hard conversations as well, which is hard for, high school kids or any level really, but definitely in high school.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a young age that kids are developing. They're trying to figure out who they are as individuals. There's that element of they want to be liked by their peers, which I think everybody, whether you're an adult or, a younger kid, everyone has a certain amount that they feel like, hey, I want to be liked by my peers. But I think in high school, it's even doubled down on, right? Because there's like, I want to be popular, or I want to be cool, or even if it's not that, even if it's just like, I want to get along with people at my school, there's that element as well that you're combating, and you're trying to make them realize like, hey, you can still hold people accountable and be a leader. And maybe in that moment, they won't like what you're saying, but it doesn't mean they won't like you as a person. It's okay to do that. And I think if you can get them to that point, that's when you start creating really good leaders. And kind of segueing that is, how important is that leadership when it comes to success of your basketball program each year?
Oh, it's super important. It could be, close to the most important part of having a successful team, because like I said earlier, it's the buy-in. Like if you don't have buy-in from all of your players to do the things that you're asking them to do, then you're not going to be a good team, right? They're not going to be sitting in help side like you want them to be. And if they don't and they mess up and you yell them as a coach, like you said earlier, that will leave some sort of impact. But if a player has leadership and they tell them like, hey, we need you help side every time, man, like that's important for this team. And they go, okay, and they got that, they'll take it to heart more. So yeah, I would say it's very important for your team to get through the season, because it's going to be rocky. Like every season, I feel like there's at some point where there's a little bit of bickering, a little bit of arguing, this guy takes these too many shots, this guy doesn't play defense amongst the players, or this guy shows up late, why is he still starting? He showed up late. Like halfway through the season, that stuff starts to happen. And so that could, implode your entire season. Like you could just go downhill from there. So that's why the leadership is so important to get through the whole entire season. I think you got to have good leaders.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we'll get into this eventually about like that accountability of, having people, okay, if they're going to show up late, now what do you do, right? And that goes on to the coach. I don't want to dive into that too much yet, but that's another level to it, because you're constantly battling this like, man, my best player's messing up. What do I do? Am I just going to sit him? Am I not? Is that going to hurt us? Is it not? Whatever. But we'll talk more about that later. I guess my next kind of question here is, I think we know the answer to this, but does the leadership that we teach them on the court translate off the court? And if so, like how does that translate into stuff in the real world? Because we talk obviously a lot about basketball here, but the reality is most of these kids are not going to be pros, right? Most of them aren't even going to be college players. So how can we teach them something that's going to help them in life?
Yeah, I mean, working on a team, and a huge part of leadership that we haven't even said is like just always doing what's best for the team. Like essentially that's what leadership is. And that's why coaches have to make the hard decisions a lot of times as the leaders. Is the coach has to try to just look at the overall picture and do what's best for the team, because they have experience doing all these things in a team setting for a sport. Once they get into the real world and they have a job, they already kind of have practiced being a great leader, and they've gone through that before. And also when you become a father and you are the leader of your family, like you have to do what's best for the family and make hard decisions in that regard. So I think it does prepare you for life, because like sports is a lot of times just like practice. Like you're getting all this practice with adversity, with relationships, with all this kind of stuff in this kind of like controlled environment where things will go wrong because you're going to lose games. And that's almost like, losing your job or something, like it's kind of like simulating life and this adverse situations you go through, but it's just practice, like doesn't really matter if you lose a game in life. So I think it does prepare us in that regard.
Yeah, I would agree. I actually think that the adversity that we see in sports, and one of my concerns as a coach is seeing too many parents pull their kids out of that adversity, right? And like, oh, it's okay, just quit because it's tough. And that we're sending the wrong message as adults to these kids, and that it's like, hey, part of the adversity that you get in sports is, yeah, like you're a freshman on varsity and you got to sit the bench this year or whatever, or maybe you're a junior on varsity and you got a bunch of seniors that are more talented and you got to sit the bench. And are you going to deal with that and deal with that adversity? Because then it's going to, like you said, teach you as you get older, okay, I'm going through this time right now that's tough, and I'm going to be able to stick it out and get through it, and then things are going to eventually get better. and then, I'll get to the next thing in my life, whatever that is. And I fear sometimes that we've gotten away from that so much. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's no different than it was 20 or 30 years ago, but it just kind of feels like a lot of times now people want to take the easy way. Like if they don't get that instant gratification, they don't get that, I'm not starting immediately right when I come into high school, or I'm a junior, or I'm a sophomore, I'm entitled to this. And I think that's where a lot of that adversity, and like you said, where players that are leaders can be able hold their teammates accountable and say like, hey, no, like you just got to wait your turn. Like you're eventually going to get there, And I think when you have better leaders on your team, you don't have those situations as often because teammates are telling each other like, no, you're fine. We're doing the right thing. We're all doing the right thing here. It's just not quite your time yet, and it'll be your time, but we're just not quite there yet. So I guess kind of for you, was there a coach or maybe multiple coaches in your life that kind of helped developed your leadership and your ability to eventually get you to where you are now?
Yeah, I would say every single coach I've had some kind of part in that, and they all kind of had their own styles as far as themselves as leaders and kind of what they expected from me as a captain. So I would definitely say like in high school when I became a captain, that was like the first step of me kind of seeing what it was like to be a leader on a team. And then in college, I was selected as a captain too, kind of like out of the blue one year. And I would just say throughout my kind of playing career, I picked up little pieces of leadership, hopefully, I think, from each coach kind of in a different way. But to be honest, man, I don't think I fully understood it at all. Really, I think I was just leading by example in every situation mostly, and maybe picked up a thing or two. But until I started coaching, when I was the leader of the whole entire program and all that kind of stuff in high school, I used to meet with somebody and we would talk about leadership actually. And that was the first time where I started to actually understand it and saw it for kind of what it was, where as far as like making the hard decisions and having those hard conversations and filling people's buckets when they're feeling down. And yeah, those kind of things. So it wasn't until I started coaching when I really learned it.
Do you think that for most people, because of what you said, they feel that they're leading at a younger age, and then they get to a point, maybe they're a coach, and they realize, oh, wow, because I kind of went through the same thing. I think back to my days when I was in college, high school, but definitely in college, and I should have said more, I should have done more, as far as trying to be a leader. Do you think most people feel that way as they go through? Because it's just kind of a coming of age as you get older and you're like, okay, I was too worried about this, that, and the other, and not enough about what was best for the program.
Yeah, I just think that all leaders at a young age are always normally, and all the captains are the guys that just are lead by example guys. I don't think it's taught. I don't think leadership is taught to players enough, or even really talked about enough. I think they're just like, you guys are going to be our leaders, okay? And the players are like, okay, thanks, I'm the leaders. But what does that really mean? I don't know. It can mean a lot of different things, and I just don't think it's taught. That's all.
Yeah, and I guess that's maybe the next question is, how do you teach this? So we've talked about it. How do you teach leadership to kids at a young age? How do you start to get them to understand this concept of what it looks like?
I think you start with the lead by example conversation maybe, but like to me that's like the youngest version of like, hey, you got to be doing the right stuff because people are going to be following you and you're the leader on this team. And so like, okay, yeah, I'm going to, make sure I get good grades and that I, follow the rules and do all this, but that's not real leadership. Real leadership is like how you communicate, like telling another teammate like, hey, you really should get off the video game the night before the game and get to bed. Like, you're our leading scorer. Like, we have a 9 a.m. game. We need you at your best tomorrow. Like that. If a high school player said that to one of his teammates, like I would be like, wow, that's a really special leader, where you're not really getting that, I don't think, from most high school players.
I think you're right about that. It kind of ties into it. And one of the questions I was going to go into was trust and accountability. Like, how does that tie into all this? And I think what you said is the biggest part is just accountability. And I think most kids are still afraid to hold each other accountable, to truly hold each other accountable. It's rare when you get someone who is willing to say, hey, no, that's not good enough, and I'm okay with telling you that's not good enough. And if you don't like it, that's fine. Because to me, I want to win, and I'm about the program and doing what's best for the program. I think as coaches, it's a little bit easier, but I still think even as coaches, I think a lot of people struggle with that balance of, do I want to be just the nice guy and get along with everybody and make everyone like me? Or am I going to be just the hard ass who's all the time just, mean and a jerk and but I'm holding them accountable, but to the point where there's no relationship between myself as a coach and the players. And I think most people tend to sway one way or the other. To me, my opinion is the best leader is the one that's in the middle. I've got the relationship with the kid. I know something about them. I like, when I spend time with them, I actually have real conversations with them. We can joke around. But then when it comes to what decisions are being made, and when they mess up, and inevitably everyone's going to, because they're kids, and everyone messes up, even us as coaches, we mess up. I'm going to be able to pull a kid aside and say, hey, that's not good enough, whether their feelings get hurt or not. And it doesn't mean you have to cuss them out and go crazy on them, but say, hey, that's not good enough, and there are repercussions for your actions. We don't do things that way. I could be wrong here, but I think that it's still even hard for a lot of adults to find that balance between those two things.
Yeah, and I think a lot of kids are more receptive to people they have a relationship with, right? So if you are just one of those yelling type, aggressive type coaches, you can scare them into doing stuff, but they're not going to do it when they're not scared. So that doesn't really work in the long run, right? You might be able to bark at them for a second, and now they're going to close out perfectly, but they're not going to be receptive. They're not going to do it when you're not yelling at them. And the saying is like, no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's really when you kind of hit the holy grail of like, the kids feel bad when they mess up, not because they're going to get yelled at, but because they feel like they let you down. And that's when you know that you are leading them the right way, because they want to do right, because they want to make you proud. And that's just different. And that's good leadership rather than just scare tactics, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that's something that I think you hit the nail on the head there when you said they're afraid to let you down because they want to do the right thing. That's such an important factor to all this. And I think another factor that we tie in that we do have a big, or can have a big impact on, is the resiliency of the players, and constantly trying to teach them that resiliency aspect of everything, right? Sports, but everything else. And that, hey, yeah, today's, maybe you're not having a great day, but you still got to show up, and we got to do what we got to do, and I'm still going to care about you, and we can have a conversation about what you're going through, but it doesn't mean that, okay, you're off the hook and you don't get to go to practice. Like, obviously there's emergency situations. I'm not talking about anything crazy. Like, we know that there's emergency situations that come up in people's lives, and that's a different story. But generally 99% of the time or more, it's not an emergency. It's like, I had a bad day at school. My girlfriend and I broke up. My friend and I got into a little argument or whatever. And if you're going to say, oh, well, you don't have to come to practice today, you're not building a leader. You're building someone who's going to quit every time something gets a little bit hard, right? And being able to take a kid and say, hey, I'm sorry you're dealing with that, but also like you're part of this team, you're important, and you're committed to this, and we need you, and you still got to show up and do your job today. I think that resiliency aspect is so big, not only in their development of the team, but them as individuals in their life. Because as you said, life's only going to get harder. I always forget the head coach of Duke on the women's side, her name, but she has this one speech I've seen a couple times, and she's talking to her players, and she's like, everyone thinks, oh, I'm going to graduate high school and it's going to get so much easier, and I'm going to graduate college and it's going to get so much easier, and then I'm going to get my first job and life's just going to get easier. And she's like, no, life gets harder. Life gets harder every step of the way. You learn how to deal with it better. Like, that's what successful people do. Life does not get easier when you have a college degree. It's not like all of a sudden you're just making millions of dollars, right? Now you've got to pay bills. Now you've got to do all this other stuff. You have a family, you got to take care of your kids. Like, all that stuff is things that you can learn in sports, is dealing with that adversity and getting through it. And I think you deal with the main way is through resiliency. It's not by being perfect, it's by bouncing back.
I agree with that. I love that about sports, is the people that can do sports are the people that can wake up at 6 a.m., go outside on a track, run a 6-minute mile, and no one told them to do it, right? Like, those are like the ultimate athletes, right? They have the ability to do hard things without anybody telling them to do it. And like, that's the ultimate, right? Those are the type of people that can get straight A's, right? Because no one has to tell them to do it. They'll do it, and they can do hard things even though they don't want to do it. Some people like literally can't do that kind of stuff. Like, they just can't say, okay, I'm going to go to the weight room tomorrow and I'm going to hit the weights, I'm going to run a mile, and I'm going to get shots up. Like, when the time comes, they're just like, I'm not going to do it, And so with sports, you're just doing that stuff constantly. Like, I remember our water polo team at our high school used to practice like 6 a.m. And I was always like, geez, that's like, you guys are some hard-nosed dudes that to wake up every single day at 6 a.m. and jump into that pool. And they're like, yeah, we're used to it now. I'm like, yeah, that's because you built the resiliency,
Again, I don't want to sound like the old guy here, but just I feel like sometimes that's getting lost. The more I'm around this, it seems like that's harder and harder to build. And I feel like kids that do stick with it, at least with my program, kids that stick with it end up being like the more resilient kids, you know, and I see some other programs that do that and build that as well. So it's something that I'm always striving for because I think it's a great lesson that can help them on the court and off the court. And I think we haven't quite gotten into this, but I mentioned it earlier, doing the right thing and teaching your kids that leadership, and then you as a coach also holding them accountable even when it's not good for your program. And what I mean by that, I shouldn't say it's not good for the program. It's not good in the moment. So for example, like kid comes in, they did something wrong, right? Maybe they cheated on a test or I don't know, they did something, right? And you find out right before the game and it's like, all right, dude, like you're suspended this game, you know, whatever it is. Like, is that, and it's your star player. Are you going to do that? You know, it's easy when it's the last guy on the bench. You're like, oh yeah, like you're suspended, you're not playing. But your star player does something like that. Are you going to suspend them or are you going to not? Like, to me, I think the answer is 100 times out of 100, you hold them accountable just like you do the last man on the bench. And that might mean that you lose tonight, you know, and that sucks. And it's hard to swallow that pill at the time. But if you don't do that, then what you do is everyone else sees that. And they're like, oh, well, you know, Johnny doesn't have to do it. So why should I? You know, and then now you're building this situation where you can create like cancerous team and a lot of infighting and, you know, players not really holding themselves accountable or their teammates accountable because you don't hold them accountable. So why, you know, you don't hold the best players accountable. So why should the other guys follow? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's part of, I think, your culture building, and that stuff's important because as soon as you let that stuff slip in your culture, then that affects your culture and it becomes part of what your identity as a program is and stuff to the other players. So yeah, the accountability piece is definitely one of the main things in leadership to me.
Yeah. And I think long term you'll win way more. I mean, I almost want to say I know, but I can't say I know. But as close as I can, you'll win way more by having that accountability in your program. You know, you might win that game that one night by, my coach used to say, making the deal with the devil. You know, to allow that guy to play. But in the long term, you'll win way more games and you'll win way more championships by having that accountability. And that's leadership for you as a coach, right? Like we've talked leadership as players. That's leadership as you as a coach, is being able to do the right thing. One of the things I was going to ask, and I'll start with this, I don't know if you have an anecdote or anything, but have you ever had a time in a game or maybe in a season where a player has displayed some leadership and it's completely turned something around for you? And I have one specifically that comes to mind, and it actually happened last year. I think we started off the season like 2-3, you know, and I felt like we had a pretty good group last year. So we go to this tournament, we lost our last 2 games in a pretty bad fashion. And afterwards, I was talking to the kids and I said, look, like we're kind of playing soft right now. I really don't know what else to say. Like we're not playing tough. We're not being physically tough. We're not giving 100% effort. It's not anything about the skills you have. It's just we're not physically and mentally where we need to be, right? And you never know. Sometimes you say something like that to the kids and they're like, oh, whatever, coach. You don't know what you're talking about, you know? And my captain turned to the other girls and just straight up was like, coach is 100% right. We're soft right now. And until we stop being soft, we're going to keep losing games. Like every single one of us is playing soft. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, let's see what happens. Boom. Went off and won like 7 in a row right after that, you know? And 100% guaranteed that moment right there was a shift because the other kids saw, oh, hold on. The captain, like who coach puts all of his trust in, also is saying the same thing. And like, she's holding us accountable. And so, yeah, we got to play harder. Like, it's not just coach just saying random stuff, right? She believes in it as well. So for me, that was a moment where I was like, okay, this is where this is paying off. Like this leadership that she has picked up is paying off and it's going to help us win games in the future. So I don't know if you ever had anything like that, but
the one that pops into my head first is like during COVID, like when we weren't allowed to work out with our players and stuff like that. I had a few players step up and do like player-led workouts and stuff like that where, you know, the school and myself wasn't involved at all, but they were still getting some workouts in. And I thought that during COVID that our players individually worked out a lot on their own. And I think it was kind of more player-led too, as far as, you know, through group chats and stuff like that. So I definitely appreciated that during those tough times. And, you know, another kind of example that pops into my head is maybe not leadership in the sense where they're holding somebody accountable, but kind of leadership in a way of like picking each other up, you know, like when a player makes a mistake and maybe they get yelled at a little bit by me and, you know, I pull them out of the game and sub them out. Like I always appreciated the player that would come up to them like, you're doing good, man. Keep shooting. You know, it's all good. Like I always appreciated that kind of leadership where they kind of pick each other up. And that seems to happen, you know, in timeouts when I'm, you know, getting frustrated, maybe getting yelling a little bit, and then hounds on three, 1, 2, 3, hounds break, and then, you know, see one player bringing them together and saying, you know, we got this, everything's okay. Like I love when that happens, because I don't know, it just seems like it just builds the camaraderie, and I don't know, it's helpful for the player that's feeling down.
For sure, 100%. That's another way, because I think as coaches sometimes you're in a position where a lot of times you're pointing out the negatives, right? It doesn't mean you're trying to be a negative person. It's just it's kind of your job is to be like, hey, we got to correct this. And you know how it is. You might come down and make 3 great plays in a row, and you're like, oh, great job, guys, great job, play after play after play, and then they mess up once, and you're like, oh man, what are we doing? We got to change this. And they'll totally not even hear the last 3 times you just told them great job, and they'll only stick in their mind that one time you said, hey, what are we doing? You know? So when you have players that do that, it helps kind of balance that out more, I think, and keep it a little bit more on the positive side, because you know how it is that confidence is everything. And if you lose confidence, it's hard to play good basketball. Yeah, that's a good point there. Okay, last couple things here. Coaches today, if someone's listening right now and they say, okay, what can I implement right now? Like, what's the one thing I can do? And it doesn't have to be a specific thing. Maybe it can be something more generalized, but what can I do to start developing better leaders in my program? Like, what's something you would say?
I would say give them responsibilities. So whether that's something pre-practice or leading warm-ups before the game, or I don't know, leading a drill in practice, even that kind of stuff goes a long way. So I would say my tip would be just give them responsibilities.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a good one. And I think you can give responsibility in small ways. Like you said, maybe it's a warm up, maybe it's just input in this. I think the more you can give them some autonomy, the more like they feel they're a part of the program. And like you said, maybe a little bit of they have some more leadership. The other one is, if you are a player, what steps can you take to be a better leader? I
would say definitely it's kind of like how you say things to your teammates. Like we keep talking about, oh, the players got to hold each other accountable. Like, yeah, you could get one player that you know is good, can do that, but they got to go about it the right way. So, you know, I've heard some players say, I don't like to play with him. You know, I just don't like to play with him. And like, you don't want to be that guy that everybody does not want to play with. You want to be the guy that makes your teammates better. And a lot of times it goes with, you know, how you say it. I don't know, if someone's turning over the ball a bunch, you know, and you have a player say, stop turning the ball over to somebody. It's like, it's not really the way to do it. Like, they should probably say, like, you know, like, hey, you know, let's be a little more conservative right now, or let's, you know, play to your strengths, man. You know, use your shot fake. I don't know, stuff like that. More constructive criticism, I think. I don't know. That's just one idea.
And obviously, there's a million different ways that you can go about it. But I think one other last thing I'll say here is, if you are a player and you're trying to become a leader, one, be willing to be accountable for yourself, right? Like, I would say be the first to criticize yourself, and not in a negative way, but like be the first to take responsibility, right? Like when something's not going your way. And because if you're taking responsibility, like, oh, my bad, that's my bad on the pass, you know, or my bad on this or whatever. And you can do that. One, you'll develop the ability to not be upset every time someone holds you accountable, and your teammates will also see like, oh, he's willing to stand up and say, hey, it's my fault. So if he's doing that, like, okay, we can listen to him because he's not just pointing. Because I know what you were talking about earlier is, if you're just yelling, hey, you're turning over, and then guess what? Once you turn it over, everyone's going to look at you and be like, you're turning it over, man. You know, and then it can turn into like a bad situation. You have to obviously know your team. Some teams can be a little bit harder on each other than others, but be willing to accept, hey, like, I'm messing up too, but like, we got to get better. You know, it's always about us, not just about me or you individually. I think that's a good way for players to try and develop their leadership. Any last thoughts on that?
One thing that we talk about a lot in our program, and it does go hand in hand with leadership, is like sacrifice. Like, I think the best leaders are willing to like sacrifice shots in the game. They're willing to sacrifice, you know, maybe Friday nights to go and do the movies, to play to train for basketball. So I think good leaders are willing to sacrifice, and that kind of turns them into like servant leadership in a way. So I do think that even if you are a captain on your team, like, you should be willing to say, like, coach, I'm willing to come off the bench if that's like what coach wants. Like, if that's what's best for the team. It really comes down to like whatever's best for the team. And I think great leaders are willing to do those kind of things.
Well said. And with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching and listening in. Hopefully you picked up something that'll help you, whether you're an individual player or a coach with your program, when it comes to leadership. Because as we talked about, it's really important, not just on the basketball court, but in the life, right? And in the long term, how are we developing these kids and making them better people and human beings? So if you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you're listening to on some audio platform, you can follow us there as well. And other than that, we will catch you guys in the next episode.